Alrighty. Do you want to intro it, or do you want me to?
No, man, you do it. This is your episode.
Alright, I'm so excited. Hi, everyone. Welcome to episode 12 of the Interdisciplinary History Podcast. I'm Victoria.
And I am Sloan.
And today we're talking about a subject I am very passionate about. I'm a bit of a nerd about it. Sloan's had to deal with me talking about this far too many times, and they have so much patience for me. It's immense. Sloan's a good friend. So we're talking about food history, which is one of the sort of aspects of history that I've found the most fascinating since I was a kid. Just,
Yeah, so in this episode, Victoria and I are both going to have some different topics that we introduce relating to food history, but also just food and historical study in general. We're going to talk about a virtual exhibition that was launched that we got to attend through Zoom. So a huge shout out to University of Guelph that put that on. We'll explain a little bit more about that. And then Victoria and I are each going to kind of bring in our own content that we did, be it themes, be it sort of information we think is really interesting relating to that, and that we want to share with you guys.
Yeah, so it's called From Our Mother's Kitchen, and it's dedicated to Anita Stewart, who was a trailblazer in the food history discipline in Canada. And it is a student-led initiative, which is very cool. It was done as a part of a course. So Rebecca Bosno, and she's basically leading this, and the students basically took a cookbook each and researched the author, researched the time that the cookbook was situated in, and scanned it in. It's all for free. It's open access with there. It's really, really fascinating and really well done. I enjoyed watching the conference immensely.
Yeah, so I just want to add a couple little details to your background that I think are going to be relevant, at least to what I want to speak about. So Rebecca Bosno teaches at the University of Guelph, and she runs a course on food history. So this online digital archive that we attended the Zoom launch party for is the product of her students' work in the archives, focusing on specific archival materials. Well, the digital archive has a really, really large number of sources. The students themselves focused in on researching 27 cookbooks that were published between 1831 to 1985. So you're looking at 150 years of Canadian history, and these include government publications, advertising type cookbooks, and compilations of traditional recipes.
Yeah, it's very interesting because they actually first went into and discussed the history of food history as a discipline. Food history has been around for thousands of years, but it really started taking off in the 1980s, which is very interesting. Ken Abala talks about this in a separate article, which I will be referencing later in my discussion of it. Basically, they talked about how many historical museums used traditional recipes, but they weren't actually historical recipes. So some were actually starting to branch out and look into historical cookbooks and historical methods. And gradually this increased in popularity, and now we're seeing courses being done, degrees being made, and also popular cookbooks talking about food history as well.
Just to clarify your thought for the audience, because you started off talking about Cannibala, and then you jumped back into what we heard at the conference. So the people who were involved in creating this project for the students had done these sort of experiential type learning activity programming related things. I think of, if you're listening in Edmonton, we have Fort Edmonton Park, which is a really large outdoor, indoor, how would I want to describe it? Like an experiential learning, or like a living museum, or one of these places where there's actors in character and you're meant to immerse yourself in it. I think of the US, I think, has Colonial Williamsburg as one of their big destinations that I would parallel this to. So the people who have been really involved in this project at University of Guelph are people who participated in putting on that style of programming, but who realized that the methodology that was being applied in designing those programming wasn't strictly good historical work. Like saying, okay, we're going to do an activity where we're all going to make bread like pioneers, but not actually baking bread in the style of pioneers because you don't have a good, valid primary source recipe.
Yeah. One of the other things they talked about is how the University of Guelph has actually one of the largest historical cookbook collections in North America, and that they have actually been working hard to do a sort of reconciliation. So basically, they were talking about how the University of Guelph has a massive collection. It's incredible. They've got over 20,000 cookbooks relating to Canadian cookery, and it's incredible. What I'm really excited about is the fact that they are actually collecting a lot of Indigenous cookbooks and essays written by Indigenous food writers, because I feel like that's one of the things I find is really unrepresented. And I think I'll talk about it more in my section, is I find that food history tends to be very Eurocentric, and it makes me very upset that it's like that. So I'm happy to see that the University of Guelph is doing this work and working towards reconciliation in make sure their archival material represents marginalized communities.
In preparation for this episode, I read a book that's edited by Claflin and Scholliers, Writing Food History, A Global Perspective. And one of the things that they lay out in their introduction is that writing food history, or writing history that focuses around food and what people are eating and how people are feeding themselves, is always interdisciplinary and always comes from a multidisciplinary perspective, because you have not only cultural history and relations, but you have to get into the sociology of what different foods mean for things like class structure, or you have to get into the economics of trade, even getting into things like the natural sciences or getting into technology, because what we are able to eat in a given place in a given time is connected to how we're able to process those foodstuffs and make them available for consumption.
Yeah, one of the reasons why I was so interested in food history is mainly because it is interdisciplinary. It mixes in so many aspects of society, but it's one of those things that really doesn't get talked about. That makes me sad, because there's a lot of amazing things we can talk about in connection with food and the history surrounding that. I've been actually seeing sort of a surge in food history on the internet, in sort of popular social media and on YouTube. I don't know if it's mainly just because of the algorithm, but I'm definitely seeing more popular content creators talking about food history, experimenting with historical recipes, and talking about the history behind those recipes and the times that they're situated in. I've taken this food course called Cooking Across the Ages, led by Professor Kanabala from the University of the Pacific.
You're right that there maybe is a tendency to discount food history or histories that are focusing in on food and foodstuffs, to discount it or to trivialize it. One of the things that the two scholars I mentioned previously talk about is the way food history is written, the media attention it gets, tends to end up being very pop history, or very colored by nostalgia or trivia, right? Like, it can be very much just oh, this recipe is from this year, or this recipe was published in that year, but not assigning any deeper meaning or not inferring anything from that, which just turns it into a piece of trivia or a little factoid or what have you. And then, yeah, like the nostalgia of this reminds me of when I was growing up, or this reminds me of something on a personal level, which is very different than this recipe is a historical primary source that can tell us something about the moment or the period or the place it came from. And I think that that is very much, as we'll talk about later on, connected to the gender divide that has existed in terms of food cultivation, food preparation, and the labor that goes into actually feeding families, communities within social orders. That in of itself opens up a lot of opportunities for interdisciplinary conversation when we start getting into feminist tracks of thought.
Absolutely, and definitely you see the gender divide in food history cookbooks that people tend to use as primary sources, because you'll find that they're mainly written by men, and they're typically men who had a higher status. And Cannibala explains that a lot of the recipes we have, the fancy ones you hear about, they were meant to be cookbooks for the aristocracy as a way of showing wealth. One of the things that Cannibala talks about, when he talks about specifically this recipe for millet polenta, and he talks about how Taillevant, who is a famous court cook in medieval France, how he basically said it was a simple recipe, but it's anything women can do. There was the expectation that women or of a certain class, or just like women in general, they would know how to do it, so there wasn't really any importance in writing it down. And you just sort of see gradually, with the increase in literacy, the increase in women's cookbooks, and some of the recipes I really look at are Martha Lloyd's cookbook. If you're a fan of Jane Austen, I highly suggest looking at Martha Lloyd's recipes, because Martha Lloyd was the sister-in-law of Jane Austen, and her cookbook has really interesting recipes that reflect the Regency period. And also, I think one of the most famous cookbooks that people are aware of is Mrs. Beaton
cookbook. Victoria, once you explain what that is, I want to share with the audience my personal anecdote about that cookbook. I think you already know it, but I think it'll make decent content.
You've told it to me, but I don't think you've mentioned it on the podcast. It definitely
hints at that interdisciplinary lens.
So Miss Beaton's cookbook, it was written during the Victorian period, and it was written by this woman. Basically, she collected a lot of recipes, but as food historians have talked about how a lot of it was just sort of plagiarized from other different female cookery book writers at the time. But it became immensely popular and sort of spawned a bunch of spin-offs, even though Mrs. Beaton passed away actually pretty soon after the book was published. But it's left an immense mark on our cultural understanding of food. One of the food blogs I did, this was a recipe from Mrs. Beaton's cookery book that Pen Vogler had done a adaptation of in her book, Dinner with Mr. Dickens. Basically, that recipe has actually remained quite popular in the cultural understanding of what is a Christmas pudding. But you also see just in general recipes that you see around, they're descendants of Mrs. Beaton's recipes.
Miss Beaton's cookbook does sort of turn Miss Beaton into a household name, the same way that Betty Crocker might be. You could just refer to that and people would have that understanding. To such a degree that when Virginia Woolf writes A Room of One's Own, there's an allusion to Mrs. Beaton in the kitchen. And it's being used in a way to say that all women are just Miss Beaton, or all women are in the position of Miss Beaton, where that's the thing that they do. I know this now because I'm friends with Victoria, and Victoria has talked about this. When I first read A Room of One's Own, it was in like my first year university, second English course that I had to take. And I had a prof who referenced that passage. He was like, "Oh, do you get what's going on in this passage?" And I'm like, "Well, not really, like it's just a name." And the interpretation that he taught in that course was that it's a pun, and that the kind of abstract female figure that Virginia Woolf is referring to is abused. She's Mrs. and she's Beaton. So that was my understanding of that passage for a very long time, because the person teaching that piece of literature to me wasn't aware of this allusion. So that's my little anecdote. But I think that goes to show how much a part of Victorian and this in society, you could drop a reference like that and her Virginia Woolf's whole audience understands who she's referring to. But it does kind of get lost in translation in time.
Yeah, Mrs. Beaton's book for household management is very fascinating.
An example then of the way that literary objects are referencing cookbooks and cooking, and the cooking practices that are common in society are being reflected through literature. But one of the people who presented at the conference for the launch of the digital archive was Fiona Lucas, and she made two really interesting points that I want to speak to now. Firstly, that we can look at cookbooks as not only historical objects, but as literary objects. And then she went on to say that cookbooks reflect to some degrees truthfully, but also to other degrees aspirationally what people ate. And I think that if we're gonna approach cooking records as historical primary sources, or instructional cooking records, things like recipes, that sort of thing, I think that's very important to keep in mind. If I think of the cookbooks that my mom has, or I think of popular recipes online today, there is that question of how often are these very elaborate recipes being made. Typically, the things you eat the most of, or the most common recipes, don't need to be written down because everybody already knows how to make those, knows how to eat those. So I think if we look at the way that cookbooks have become more elaborate from the 50s onward and the 1950s housewife through the 60s and 70s, but even approaching today, when you've got all of these recipes, air quotes, being used online, where it's things like stunt food, if you're familiar with that term. So the idea that you've got this highly visual, very odd way of producing a cooked food that makes a very interesting video to watch, but is perhaps not practical, or even something like what was really popular last year, at least popular in terms of there was a lot of online buzz talking about it. The Bon Appetit focaccia bread that has been republished in so many places. Are we in the future going to come across that and think that this was a craze that people were actually really on board with and people were putting the time in to make for themselves? Do cooking records sort of have the potential to lead us astray in our understanding of what people by and large are eating in the past? And that probably creates a lot of historical legwork, which may be why we haven't seen this develop, or we haven't seen it develop in a way that makes it a very concrete and significant branch of historical inquiry.
Yeah, one of the things I was thinking of, what would be a primary source, or like a food primary source recipe from our era that people would just think of in 150 years and think that is just the most wacky, out of this way thing. And I was thinking, you know, those rainbow donuts a couple of years ago?
Actually sticks out to me right now, and it'll be such a fad that if you're listening to this episode in a couple of months, maybe it's just niche and you don't know what I'm talking about anymore. But the sandwich that is just a bell pepper cut in half instead of bread with your regular sandwich fillings, that to me is viral, and I've seen it on so many things that are eventually going to be historical primary sources, you know, social media, blogs, YouTube and the like, TikTok, whatever your poison is. Are we going to look back and be like, oh, this was really popular in 2021 to, instead of having bread, use a bell pepper? Because I don't think that that's actually popular. At least I'm not inclined to try it myself. And celebrity has something to do with that too, right? It's almost maybe a good thing that media didn't exist the way that it used to in previous centuries, because everybody would be on the Lord Byron diet of boiled eggs and vinegar to lose weight. But instead that gets to just be, again, a little bit of trivia that's fun and neat, doesn't really tell us about the world much. If we had more sources and we knew it was more popular, that might tell us something about male beauty standards in the era. But as far as I know, that's just a weird little thing that someone found in his journal. Not super significant in my mind to understanding either him as a figure, which isn't particularly interesting to me on the whole, but also the society.
Oh god, that's disgusting. I despise bell peppers. And also, as a person who has eaten gluten-free for, I ate it for a good year, and I might actually have to go back to it because they think I might have celiac disease. The idea of using bell pepper as a slice of bread terrifies me. Sloan knows I will eat basically anything except for cucumbers and bell peppers.
Yeah, cucumbers are a prefer not to for me too. I'll call out my second grade teacher on that right now. We learned decomposition through her leaving a slice of cucumber on her desk in a Tupperware for about 3 months. Seeing any piece of produce liquefy will turn you off it.
Ugh.
We should probably try to get a little bit back on track here. So yeah, the exhibition is called From Our Mother's Table. It's named after one of the cookbooks that's actually on display. Everything is contained within the second half of the 19th century, well into the end of the 19th century. If you were interested in rural life, agriculture, cultural groups in Canada in that time period, there's also a lot of content looking at the roles of men and women in the preparation, serving, and preservation of food. Cultivation, there's even some information on home remedies and that sort of thing. Victoria, one of the things that we've talked about in our setup for this episode is food and patterns of historical immigration. Do you want to speak a little bit on that now?
It's actually very interesting. So one of the things that Cannibala talks about in his Quebecois section on food history is that sometimes when food gets transplanted from another culture, it gets fossilized. Like, some of the ingredients change, but other times it'll just stay the same. So when he was talking about how Quebecois cuisine reflects French cuisine, he says it's very medieval because of these, like, spices and stuff. I mean, it's delicious, but it's very different than what we would think of as French cooking. I grew up eating tourtière and tire-la-neige and sort of those kinds of dishes because I lived in Ontario for a good portion of my life as a child. Often would have Quebecois food because we're so close to that area. When Cannibala describes historic Quebecois cuisine, he says cuisines always evolve, especially when transplanted. So it's important to recognize this, especially when it comes to cultures moving around the world or sort of classes changing. We don't always just see, like, foods from different cultures moving across continents. We also see it moving across classes. Sloan, when you think of oysters, lobsters, and snails, sort of like, what kind of cuisine do you think of?
I already know this one, that historically, if you live in seafaring areas where lobsters and mussels are highly available, they're peasant food.
Yes, for hundreds of years, oysters, lobsters, snails, mussels, those were like the poorest of the poor. Like, that was what you had. There's a really fun TV series, and I forget the name of it. It's got one of the hosts of Great British Bake Off. It's actually fascinating. So the two hosts basically live in a historic period for a week. They have to wear the clothing, they have to use the same devices, they have to eat the same food. And they're sort of experiencing that with a 21st century perspective. And during one of those moments, they went to the seaside and they're like, oh my gosh, we're eating all these delicious foods. And yet they were, like, deemed for the poorest of the poor. Gradually, because of sort of expansion of the middle classes, that became gradually an upper class food. And that's why you see on menus lobsters and stuff being so expensive, even though, like, over 150 years ago, that was,
Kimberly
like,
Voss
so cheap.
Writes a very good academic work on this book called The Food Section, Newspaper Women, and the Culinary Community. And her main focus is on the way that media is shaped by, but also shaping the landscape of food in the US. And I mean, Canada, you can probably make a similar argument in the second half of the 20th into the 21st century. But something that she talks about a little bit early on in the book is a argument made by a different scholar in 1959 who is describing the loss of French cuisine from the American culinary scene. And he lists essentially 3 reasons why this is happening. So expense being one, and a lack of training facilities domestic in the US that are specializing in French-style cuisine. But he also points to changes in immigration laws that happen in the 1930s that reduce the number of immigrants coming from Europe, and the effect that has in the availability and pervasiveness of French cuisine in America. And I find that very interesting because it's not as though there isn't a demand or a desire or that these foods aren't wanted. But there's these other social, geopolitical forces that are shaping the availability of that.
Yeah, and that makes a lot of sense.
On the topic of the way that the Second World War shapes Americans' cuisine landscape, Victoria, do you know the difference between hamburger and Salisbury steak? And how that relates to the Second World War?
Yes. because when I went to Air Cadet Camp, the food was terrible. And I remember everyone getting very excited because there's this thing called Salisbury Steak, and it sounds so fancy. It's just hamburger covered in gravy.
But do you know why those two separate dishes emerge and why they're popular at different times? I'll tell you in our audience. So, hamburger obviously is named after a German town. When you have the Second World War, and to a lesser extent, I suppose, the First World War, there's a very strong anti-German sentiment and a very kind of pervasive, almost paranoia about German culture in the US. So you see during this time period recipe books and menus at restaurants and advertisements moving away from the hamburger and instead preparing Salisbury steaks. Salisbury, of course, being Austrian rather than German. So that's very interesting to me. We see this with other dishes too. Sauerkraut doesn't disappear from the American market, but it's rebranded by a lot of restaurants and suppliers as Liberty cabbage or Victory cabbage. So in that way, even our menus aren't immune to propaganda during war times, which I think is very, very interesting.
Yeah. And also, I think with food availability, there's also assimilation, the forced change of culture. One of the things I've tried to do, researching my family history and understanding the past, is trying to understand it through food. It's very hard to find cookbooks for foods that aren't, say, English, French, sort of American, Canadian kind of thing, or Italian. And I might say German. There's still less cookbooks on German food that are translated to English, but most specifically is Hungarian food. I wanted to try that out because I never had the chance to. I wasn't really exposed to it, so I had to actively seek it out. But there's very, very few cookbooks that are published or that are available to the public that have the very regional sort of cooking books or recipes available. And I think that shows just sort of how assimilation has an effect on not only just people and culture, but also
I
the
think
things
that's
we
very
eat.
interesting. The two scholars I've already cited so far, Claflin and Scholliers, one of the things they talk about very early on in their book is they compare sort of the modern rise of convenience foods and fast foods, which certainly have their origin in the post-Second World War, Cold War period, when you've got this kind of ideal of an American dream. You've got all these convenience products that are meant to make housewives' lives very easy. You've got sort of restaurant culture and that sort of stuff. And then they compare that to contemporary things like the slow food movement or food tourism, where there's this sort of interest in having an authentic taste, in finding an authentic taste, which I think can very quickly become rather colonial in its view, especially when you get into something like tourism, depending on how you're approaching it. But these editors are very quick to point out that food tourism, seeking the authentic taste, etc., isn't true historical work. However, what you're describing, I think, is, because what you're describing is looking at the legacies of the way cultures have been affected. I absolutely think that it is valid historical work and valid application of historical methods to use those sorts of things as part of culture reclamation and trauma treatment to some degrees. So I think that's very interesting.
Mm-hmm. I think it's just very interesting, and I think eating a certain food from the past and trying to recreate a recipe in the best way you can, it doesn't really seem like it would teach you anything about the past, but flavors themselves are pictures of the times that they're built in. Like, say, in the medieval period, you see a lot of spices being used, but they're all very sweet. because people don't really know how to use the spices and to balance the flavors. So you'll often see like sugar and meat together. And it's one of the things that I wrote in my notes is that oftentimes we see historical food and we see bad. But I think like with many recipes and cookbooks is that any cookbook can have bad food in it, or just recipes that just don't work out. Recipes don't always work out. So of course there's not going to be all good food, but that doesn't mean all of it is bad food. If you're sort of getting my meaning, it's so when we're looking at historical cookbooks and stuff, you'll see people go out and take a recipe and be like, oh, look, this wild recipe from, say, the 1950s or the Victorian period, and be like, look how gross it is. Look at all these disgusting ingredients. And you'd be like, well, that is only just one food. That isn't the entire picture of the cooking in that period, or like in different sort of regions around the world, because it's all different.
Yes, and I think when we get into the way we look at some foods and some recipes of the past, there is that element of sensationalizing, like, oh my god, look at this very odd dish. How did that come to be? Who thought of that? And I have a issue, obviously, with when we sensationalize the past and we don't look at it with its context, because it very quickly just turns it into trivia. I think it's a lot more interesting to be like, why did a certain ingredient become popular at the time? Why is it not popular anymore, too? And you can probably find economics being a big influencer in that, but not always strictly economics or strictly trade. Like, one of the things I've heard noted in some of the readings I did for this was the, like, jelly salads, jelly meat dishes, jelly dessert dishes that were really popular through the 60s and 70s into the 80s a little bit, how those have sort of disappeared from our cultural consciousness. And one of the things that was suggested is that the rise in the health awareness movements, the rise in diet culture especially, have been a big blow against those types of recipes, because you have increased concerns about saturated fats, about fats in general, about the contents of these foods. So that, I think, is interesting. Or another example being like birch bark tea, which perhaps is not super appealing to my palate, but the fact that it served a very important purpose as a dietary staple. Or something like alcohol and like the small beers that we see throughout Europe in the medieval and early modern period that were dietary staples, and our own cultural understanding of alcoholic beverages being so removed from that we might falsely assume that everybody was drunk back then if it was their main source of calories. But recognizing that the beers of that era were nowhere near as potent as contemporary beers.
Yeah, I tried actually, as a way of dealing with chronic pain, and actually trying out herbal methods. And I found one company that uses primary sources, and I just bought it for fun, see what it is. And they use things like raspberry leaf and peppermint. And you think, well, there's a reason why people use these things when there wasn't painkillers that you could just pick up at the grocery store. There is a reason why people use them.
Some pretty decent theories articulated, obviously just theories, about some of these medieval spells or kind of pseudo-medicinal rituals that have been made up that involve a strange assortment of foodstuffs or biological stuffs, like burying an apple with some other things in a jar. Stuff that comes across being very superstitious, but the theory is that at some point this could have, through dumb luck and circumstance, produced a strain of penicillin, for example, and someone then consumed that, they were better off for it, and that leads to people continuing to retry that. And obviously the science hasn't been there to isolate what's actually happening, so it falls into this realm of being very silly superstition and something that we can kind of joke about.
Hmm. It's off topic, but if you guys are interested in reading like a fiction novel where that's used and sort of discussed, talking about like sort of folk medicine, it's called Hamlet and Judith by Maggie O'Farrell, and it talks about Shakespeare's wife and their children, and specifically the death of their son Hamlet. But there's a scene,
quickly,
and it's actually really sad.
Victoria did pronounce that correctly. Hamlet is a play that Shakespeare wrote, but he did also have a son who was called Hamlet.
Yes, and
I apologize for interrupting Victoria. Go for it. I'm interested to hear about this work of historical fiction.
No, it's all good. And it is a thing. And at the end of the spoiler, Hamlet is put on as a way of sort of resurrecting Hamlet from the dead. But there's a scene, and it's very sad, but also, like, it makes you wonder, did this work at some point for someone? It's basically, a plague doctor comes in and hands Shakespeare's wife a dried frog. It's like, put this on your child's chest.
I see why you're drawing off that right now, because that does connect to sort of those folk medicine traditions that seem fairly routed in superstition. The point I was trying to make earlier is I can see how through coincidence having something that preparing a certain piece of produce in a way, leaving it for a while, it molds and that produces penicillin. If anyone wants to tell me how there's a potential kind of 1 in a million circumstance where a dried frog would help somebody, reach out to us on Twitter or Instagram. I would be very interested, but maybe trying to get back to talking about food history, which is where I was initially going with that, is spells quite often are recipes with promised extra effects. And we can, again, we could sensationalize and we could laugh at it. Or we could say, well, why, like it says something about the plague to know that spices were being used to try and ward off the plague. People were at the very least aware that the aspects of illness, be it sickness, be it kind of the uncleanliness, were in some way connected to health problems.
Tell us. Explain it to me. I will be very happy to hear your theories. But yeah, and spoiler, it does not work.
Oh,
but
okay. Well, I mean, on the one hand, that
just
makes me happy because I'm glad that the fiction author didn't go totally crazy with what they were going to include. I guess no one really needs to message us on our social medias now, but if you wanna, we'll probably message back.
It does not work, but what is the reason? Why did they get the dried frog in the first place?
Yes, and we know
that's
the
the question.
Spells that often feature in Shakespeare and other writers of his time's works, they are connected to the medieval or the early modern traditions associated with mysticism, associated with apothecary practices. But, like, if you take something like the potion that the witches in Macbeth are reciting, and there's all these odd ingredients, newts, eyes, etc., those are actually metaphors for herbs, newt's eyes in particular being mustard seed. I would maybe like to get us back a little bit more on topic with the episode, if that's okay, Victoria, just because we're straying pretty far into fiction at this point. Something else that I think is worth keeping in mind when we look at food history or history themes centered around food is we can look at economics and trade as a source of where things people are eating are coming from. But we can also look at the labor that goes into food production and use food in that way as a grounding point for our historical inquiry. Whether we're looking at the gender divide, whether we are looking at agricultural practices, whether we are looking at even factory-style production. That opens us up to a lot of theoretical frameworks. Obviously, there's been a pretty strong gender divide in the production of food within households, so if you wanted to bring in feminist theory, really any conflict theory applies itself well to the study of food because you are looking at societal roles in how society feeds itself.
Also, so one of the things I know about historical cooking is that it's very vague and talking about means of production. When you look at a historical recipe, typically you'll just see words. There is no measurements. It's sometimes just very frustrating because you don't understand like what they want. And Cannibala talks about how oftentimes people will just leave out instructions because they think you're going to get it, or they don't want you to recreate the same product that they made because, you know, they want the fame, they want the money, they want the sort of prestige that comes with making that dish. But also he says that these were just because people had the skills, they knew how things were done, that there was this expectation that they would know how to reproduce the same thing using just the sort of vague guidelines. In the conference, there was a gentleman, he came in and he discussed how one of his books that he's collected, there was a recipe for ginger snaps, but it was very vague. There wasn't really any sort of instruction about how to make it. Just, here's the ingredients, have at it. One of the things Cannibala says is that, quote, "We are much less adept cooks today precisely because we depend on exact, almost scientifically rigid recipes that in some ways take the fun and creativity out of cooking. They don't let you improvise," which is page 4 of his Cooking Across the Ages cookbook. While I don't agree we're less adept, because I think that more people are having the skills.
Yeah, and I think that connects again to the idea of cookbooks having this aspirational quality, or this, the goal would be to cook on this level, but that's maybe not what the day-to-day entails.
As an Italian, I always put at least 4 or 5. I like
something
garlic.
That we have in our contemporary that will eventually be a primary source for future historians that may be wildly misleading to them, or at the very least has the potential to mislead anyone who's not looking past the surface level, is something like the Canadian Food Guide, or any food guide. Most governments with a publicized healthcare system or what have you have a food guide or recommended dietary framework. And we understand in our contemporary that taking one of those and looking at it doesn't actually tell you that much about how Canadians or Americans or anyone else in the world is actually eating. But it is a type of documentation that carries some risk in the future if they don't understand that the food guide is a recommendation or it's aspirational. And we can take the counter direction of that and look at what has happened to give rise to those guidelines, because they're not the same across the board. Again, not something I'm prepared to get far into, but if you look at the way food guides have been developed, private industries have had a huge role in that. The American recommendations on dairy have been made partially through the efforts of lobbying by dairy farmer organizations. Or things like recipes that are tailored towards specific dietary requirements. That is the majority of, I think, recipes that we're going to see that are novel to this period. Our own contemporary, I mean, when we future historians look back at us. And that may give the false impression that the shift towards these eating habits has been more widespread, but we know that that's not strictly true, and that might be a false impression. Because again, our convenience foods or our foods that we grew up with, we don't need to buy a recipe book. And publishers or the food and lifestyle section of a particular magazine or food bloggers don't feel the need as strongly to publish those recipes that are almost intuitive to us, to make those things that we've always been making and that we learned to make from our families.
Yeah, or like in the past. That's one of the things I was thinking about, is the fact that a lot of cookbooks or recipes have been lost because it's only those of the elites in society that have been really remembered. So all these crazy dishes, they're what's remembered, not the foods of disenfranchised or the marginalized communities or people of a lower class. Those aren't the recipes that we have, and people just assume that the food wasn't important because it has been lost, because a lot of it was just, it was training. people were trained from a very young age to know these recipes and to not really need the guidance of cookbooks. And I guess people will think now that people cook more now because we have the cookbooks, but it's also maybe it's just the fact that there wasn't really record.
Very true that cooking is something that happens in the private sphere of the home. And so many more of the records that we have are from the public sphere. So you're not getting as many family recipes recorded as you are getting the recipes from people who did it vocationally. You brought up earlier, and I think we should come back to it, that this digital archive that spurred our interest in this topic, or at least my interest in this topic, you clearly know a lot about this topic and have been interested in it for a long time. You mentioned they were putting down new historical records of indigenous cooking recipes and creating records for topics that were previously passed down through oral traditions. And I think that, like, in no way to discredit the traditions of oral transmission of information, but I think when we are archiving information, it is vital to make sure that we're archiving all types of information and using those archives as an opportunity to make sure that things that are at high risk of being lost and things where we know a lot of material has already been lost is put down so it won't be lost further.
One of the things I was thinking about and writing about in my preparation for this episode is that I find that food history tends to be very Eurocentric and that it's focused mainly on sort of foods of colonizers, which makes me very upset. But I found 2 cookbooks, and I think that people really need to check them out because they're amazing. They're by 2 Black food historians who I'd like to highlight, which are Tony Tipton Martin and Michael W. Twitty, and I'll have links in the description. But they're basically examining Black food history and giving that context and also like explaining how we can learn from that food. I think that one of the things that I really thought of with food history is that since they've focused more on the elites and not on the more marginalized communities, one of the reasons why I was so happy to see Indigenous cooking being included is that I think that marginalized groups need to have their stories told in every way, and it's...
Yeah, and I think it's also very true to keep in mind that any records that we look back at are typically top-down records of society, in that most records are left behind not by the majority of society, but by the elites of society. So I definitely think that you're correct when you point to something being Eurocentric and when you talk about the importance that we don't continue that tradition. Also recognizing that recipe writing and writing about food in general is a source of income for a lot of people, or can be a career path. Katie Voss's book, who I spoke about earlier, The Food Section, Newspaper Women, and the Culinary Community, she talks about how, so in the Second World War, we know that women take on a lot of roles previously held by men. And not to be excluded from that is the fact that a lot of women begin writing for newspapers about the war and about other news topics while the men are off fighting the war. So when the men return from war, obviously a large number of these women are simply laid off and their jobs are given to the men. But there is also a rise in allowing women to write in new food sections, or what we might term today as lifestyle sections, the home economics page. New women's magazines or new domestic magazines are also becoming a lot more popular. That sort of stuff. And that's interesting in the way Kimberly Voss approaches that, because the argument that she makes is that while this is connected to a lot of rhetoric and a lot of propaganda that women need to get back into the household, and there's this sort of post-World War II, Cold War era invention of the idea of a traditional housewife, that these women are actually being tasked with writing the stuff that encourages other women to return to domesticity, which I do have to wonder if there wasn't ever any internal conflict for anyone, or if they were conscious that they played that dual role. At the same time, many of these women choose to write under pen names or sometimes a team of writers and editors will all be writing under one pen name that's sort of a character that's been built as this advice giver.
Oh, yeah. Basically, food has often been seen as women's work. So I'm not surprised that food writing has been used as a means of keeping women in a certain place in society. I think it's great that food historians are recognizing that food writers have had an immense effect on our food history and the way we eat food in general. Kennebala, in his article Food History on the Plate, Current State of Food History, and Jonathan Rees as well in his article State of the Field, Food History, Food Studies, and Food Writing, is that interest in food history has been actually reinvigorated by food writers taking interest in the foods that we're eating and sort of the history behind it. So it's kind of hard to think, is their effect positive? I really don't know.
I get what you're talking about, and I think it relates back to what we said towards the beginning of this episode, where food history is so often romanticized, and I think that a lot of what's being talked about as food history is perhaps not good historical work because the people doing it are not historians by trade. Definitely, you used the term armchair historians earlier. Exactly, pop historians, people who perhaps are not approaching it with academic rigor. And that makes it difficult for us to learn through our secondhand sources, because our secondhand sources are not being created by people who are using good methodologies. So, yeah, I think you and I would love to read more on this, but we want to make sure that it's well-grounded and well-supported historical work.
Yes, and one of the things is that because food history is such a recent discipline and is not exactly recognized and sort of studied at a lot of institutions, is that a lot of these people who are studying food history are just sort of armchair detectives or just doing it from the home. It's a hobby, it's a pastime, so people aren't always going to put in the work to study it from a true academic historian's perspective.
If you want to be critical of academia at large, which I do think that people by some degrees are able to do, it goes beyond just methodologies into ethics. There is a huge risk when you are an outsider trying to make claims about a particular cultural practice, which food is almost always culturally bound in some way. You can run into things like Orientalism, as described by Edward Said, where you're coming at it from this perspective that's making it mystical or making it out to be something that it's really not. You're making outlandish claims, you're making inappropriate claims. I think we see that a lot with so-called health foods that are usually marketed through the suggestion that this is an ancient, traditional practice, but quite often the person asserting it's an ancient, traditional practice belonging to a certain group of people does not come from that group of people, which is harmful. It perpetuates stereotypes, it perpetuates the idea of the other, it degrades.
Yeah.
Are you following what I'm saying? Do you know what I'm trying to get at with this, Victoria? I'm not sure if I'm being clear.
I do know what you mean, because when I was writing my notes, I was really thinking about food history. It's so important, but there's also a risk of cultural appropriation, and that people will try a recipe, but they won't try to understand the recipe in its context and where does it come from? Why is this important? Trying to understand the social and cultural importance of that
the risk
dish.
Of creating the false impression of a monolith, or trying to purposefully construct a monolith from maybe one recipe that you found in one settlement and trying to say that that is indicative of an entire culture. Yeah, we do know that descriptions of other groups' foods can be used as a part of racism and can be used to describe groups affiliated with groups in a degrading way. And I'm borrowing that argument from a scholar named Jeffrey Pillier. I can't bring the name of his book to mind right now. It'll be in the description below if you're interested in that.
Yeah, people will just try a recipe and say that is the picture of that cuisine. I don't want to eat anything else from it. I think when we're studying food history, we have to try to understand it and appreciate the cultures that we're looking at. Anthony Bourdain, one of the things that Sloan and I talked about in prep for this episode is how he did a great job at doing food anthropology, trying to understand dishes, but also the cultures that they're surrounded by. And that's really the approach that we should be taking to food history, is that like we need to understand the cultures and appreciate
them. Yeah, I actually want to give credit to someone who our listeners have heard from, Amanda de Bruhl, who was in our episode where we talked about Is History a Science? They were the one who pointed out to me and let me know that a lot of anthropology students were very engaged with Anthony Bourdain and the shows and content he produced because what he was doing was essentially food anthropology. And Amanda talked about how the anthropology community really did regard him as a loss, which was very eye-opening for me because I hadn't really thought about his content from an educational standpoint before. I knew he did a lot with travel, I knew he did a lot with cuisine, but I hadn't thought about the anthropological or cultural studies perspective he was doing. Yeah, that's very interesting. If you guys haven't heard the episode with Amanda, I thoroughly encourage you to go check it out.
I would like to see more own voices food historians brought forward, because I feel like food history is such a white discipline. I don't know if I'm saying this right. It's just that sometimes there just isn't a cultural sensitivity applied to food history, and that makes me upset.
Yeah, I think what you're saying is very true. And I think that a lack of own voices history is, or a non-inclusive set of voices in history is absolutely something that perpetuates colonialism. So I think your critique is very, very valid and an important one to make.
Yeah, I think that's another concern we have to think of in food writing in general.
One other topic that I think people could also choose to engage in if they want to look at this is the way that certain food movements get linked to social movements. For example, in our contemporary, we have had kind of a return to the idea of practicing meatless Mondays, which today is sort of being used as a form of environmentalism, looking at the way that meat production affects our environment and the environmental cost of that. But certainly the initial idea of Meat Mondays going back to the Second World War as part of rationing. Or you could look at the way that vegetarianism gets linked to pacifism at various points in history. You can look at the rise of availability of different foods through, as we've already talked about, globalization and immigration. You can look at the way food production becomes tied to ethical issues. Today we have a really big focus, and it's a really big selling point for a lot of brands to be ethically sourced or to be free trade or fair trade. In the early 19th and late 18th century, there was a social movement being cultivated around free man sugar in response to and in protest of slavery in the British Empire.
Oh my god.
Yeah, so there's lots of topics that you can approach this without, as Victoria and I have discussed, getting caught up in this one recipe as a piece of trivia, and that's all I can get from it.
Yeah. I think one of the things that we've talked about on this podcast is how it's important to seek education and look past what's before you. Like, just try to look and research the things you're consuming, not just like with media, but in the food you're eating, the clothing you're wearing. Trying to understand the cultural context, because everything is sort of a descendant of history. That's it. It's
all
just
right.
about
well,
the history
I think
moves.
we're coming right up on time. Thank you, everybody who listened to this episode, which was Victoria's pet project. Previously, we did the episode on the trial of the Chicago 7, which was my pick. So if you've listened to this episode and not the Whole World is Watching History episode, please go and listen, unless you feel like playing favorites, which, I mean, I can't fault you if it's your favorite. She's pretty great.
Aw. Well, Sloan, you're my favorite because you're my bestie. I just used the most cringeworthy word.
Yeah,
but
you
yes.
did. And you know what? I could edit it out, but where's the fun in that?
I've had so much fun talking to you about
this
one.
I got a lot more into this and got a lot more out of it than I thought I was going to. So
yeah,
I really do appreciate this being your pick because I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, it was awesome. I enjoyed talking about it. Well, thank you for joining in on me and letting me talk to you about my hyperfixations, because I'm passionate about food history, and it was awesome. I enjoyed talking about it.
Anytime. All right. Thanks, everybody, for listening. Social media is in the description below. Citations are in the description below. And if you are so inclined, we have a Patreon link in the description below. We've got some pretty accessible tiers if you are interested in donating, and we do shoutouts as well as some other benefits, so I invite you to check it out. And I wish everybody a really good week. I am editing alone in my room quite late at night at this stage, so you're not going to hear Victoria's voice say goodbye, but she also wishes you well.
Before we sign off, Sloan and I would like to acknowledge that MacEwan University, this podcast, and all the content we create are located and produced on Treaty 6 territory. This land has traditionally and continues to be a home, place of gathering, and meeting ground for many Indigenous peoples. This includes the Nakota Sioux, Niitsitapi, Métis, Saulteaux, and Cree First Nations.